are not necessarily those of WTJX, its board, staff, or underwriters.
What's up, everybody? It's your girl Desiree here, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Welcome Mat. I'll be filling in for Andre and Kia today, but I'm not here alone. We've got a special guest in the house today, and I'm joined on set by our very own Virgin Islands Attorney General, Denise George. Denise, how's it going?
It's going great, thank you.
That's awesome to hear. So I'd like to use this opportunity to discuss something we've seen happening too often as of late, which are reports of sexual assault in our community. What are your thoughts of the recent pattern of incidents that we've been reading about?
Well, unfortunately, I have to say that the pattern is not just recent. It's been going on for quite some time, for many, many years, and it is horrific. It is sexual assaults are among the most damaging types of crimes and the hardest to prove. And when you think about the fact that it is usually underreported, you're only seeing a fraction of what is actually happening. It's even more devastating.
That is true. Mm-hmm. That is definitely factual. So we could talk to the audience a little bit about the difference between sexual assault and sexual harassment, because I know sometimes that kind of gets like blurry. Mm-hmm. And there are definitely, in the legal world, two different understandings of what those are. Yeah. So sexual assault.
Mm-hmm. Well, sexual assaults, those are crimes, always crimes. Sometimes there is overlap between sexual assault and sexual harassment, because sometimes a part of the sexual harassment is committing sexual assaults.
Right.
But sexual assault encompasses rape and unlawful sexual contact, which are significant felonies in the Virgin Islands. Sexual harassment deals with unwanted sexual advances, usually in the workplace, and that could be verbal, that could be without touching, that could be some kind of coercion and intimidation of a sexual nature. But that is more of a civil aspect, a civil type of offense. Although serious, it is civil, but as I indicated, that sometimes the form of sexual advances might encompass the crime of unlawful sexual contact, when there's a touching, when there's, or even rape.
Right, especially if it continues to go on. And I know culturally, we have a pattern of, just kind of like laughing it off, or, finding an excuse. Yeah, he always been like that, but it, like you said, then it turns into something more, and then it's like, you're trying to backpedal into, well, this has actually been a pattern of this person sexually harassing, and now it's led into sexual assault or an unlawful sexual contact, as you mentioned. Do you think that we have a culture of accepting abusers, or?
I think in a lot of ways we do have, unfortunately, in our culture of blaming the victim or shaming the victim. And rather than focusing on the heinous nature of what the person did. Now, this is not just unique to our community, because it's especially in small communities, you'll find that. Right. Because most sexual perpetrators, sexual offenders, are family members, people that you know, friends. And a lot of times people, especially in a small community, don't want to believe that a person that they know, a friend of theirs, who seems like a nice person, is capable of that. Right. So a lot of times the focus is on not believing the victim, or just actually being very like mean to the victim of these crimes. So it's very difficult.
Right. Yeah. It ends up being muddy water, because we end up being so close, like you said, to the perpetrator and to the suspects, and trying to find where we could justify their actions. But at the end of the day, sexual assault is just
wrong. It happens too much. A lot of victims don't come forward and report sexual assault. And, because of those things, like, okay, well, nobody will ever believe me, or I don't want to be subjected to that kind of,
Right,
ridicule.
public scrutiny,
Yeah,
and I've
and all
seen it
that.
in numerous cases where they've kind of like villainized
Yes.
the victim, and brought up all these, alternative things about this person's background. And it was just kind of like, well,
which has nothing to do
that doesn't
with the
mean
crime
that they
that this
deserve to
person
be
committed.
sexually
Right.
assaulted,
Right.
and so I think that a lot of times we kind of get like wrapped up in that. And then people also get like a little wrapped up in false rape accusations, which I think is another thing that people have to talk about, because while that is something that happens, more oftentimes than not, it's
Definitely, that is
Right.
such a small fraction
Right.
of sexual assault, and just like we're saying with persons who it happened to, the victims, it's so hard for them to report it for many reasons.
Right.
So it's very seldom a person will want to lie about it. So usually that's what happens. So
Right.
so yeah, that is definitely an issue. But it's an issue and it's a problem because people seem to want to blow that out of proportion, false reporting, because it really doesn't happen. But I truly believe that that's just a part of the not wanting to believe what
Right.
happened, and they want to focus again on finding ways of vilifying the victim.
What are some of the laws that we do currently have in place when it comes to sexual assault, and then do you foresee any policies in the future that could change, that could assist us in combating this, because this is an issue.
It is a serious issue.
For somebody that's a new mom, it's like
Yes, yes, it is. Well, the laws that we have, let's say the laws of sexual assault, the crimes are rape and unlawful sexual contact.
Okay.
Now, rape deals with anyone who perpetrates an act of sexual intercourse or sodomy upon a person without their consent.
Okay.
And that could include by force, by coercion, by drugging them,
Right.
by just performing the act when they're unconscious or not able to give consent. But whenever they perform those kinds of acts of sexual intercourse or sodomy, and the person is not in the position to give consent or has not given consent, that is rape. And there are different degrees of that, of rape. And also then there's unlawful sexual contact, which may not amount to rape, but it is like an offensive touching, a sexual touching
Molestation.
of a person with their genitals, or touching a person's genitals or buttocks or anus and at breasts. And so that would be an unlawful sexual contact. That is less serious than the rapes, but yet it is serious as well. And they are felonies.
A lot of people also in sexual assault cases start to kind of blame themselves a little bit for what happened. Like, well, maybe I shouldn't have, been in this position, or maybe But I think that, like, overall as a community, like, what do you think is a messaging that we should put out there to everybody? And this is not just to sexual assault survivors, but just to everybody who could be a victim, which is everybody, men and women, children, everybody.
Children, right. And we've seen it all. And I think the message out there, first of all, to the victims, to find some way to report it to someone that you trust.
Okay.
A lot of times, victims, a lot of times you don't find out, and the report comes through other people, especially with children. Sometimes you find out that a child may tell a friend, and the friend tells a teacher, and then the teacher tells someone. But it is so hard already what the victim is going through, but the encouragement is that find someone you trust and have some kind of avenue or resource where you know that you can call and you can get the help that you need. And education is so important, to educate people as far as, this behavior is wrong, why it is that they're afraid to come forward. The idea of a sexual predator is not, the boogeyman that looks,
Creepy.
one sort of way or one other kind. They will look just like you and me.
Exactly.
They look like your father, like they can look like your mom. You can look like your brother, your friends, close. And that is something that people have to understand, so that there's not that sudden, feeling like, oh no, it couldn't be that person because, they're so nice or they're so whatever.
Right. That's my friend from high school, He would he never did it to me. A lot
Right.
of people like
They
to
say that
bust
too.
that line, oh, he never did it to me, so why?
So he couldn't have done it to
you,
her
or
him.
whatever.
Yeah,
and
right.
and it never ends up being the truth. And so coming from a legal standpoint, what would you say is the difference between is a charging document and then like being accused? Because I know that like especially at some of the end of the articles, they'll say, please be aware that, this is just a charging document and so, just for the community's clarity, what exactly does that mean? And in the process of...
Okay, when there's a charge, there's always an accusation.
Okay.
There can be an accusation. Once an accusation then turns into a charge, which means that it's reported and then we file charges based on evidence, based on an investigation. Right. Then those are formal charges. So charges are accusations, actually, but they are accusations based on evidence. And then the criminal charges are filed based on the facts that match up to the elements of the crime. Okay.
I see.
So, but then someone can have an accusation who has not reported, who started to report it, but there's nothing really supporting it. So that's really what that is. Now, when you see something, and I've done that too in issuing press releases when someone's arrested, I make it very clear that yes, they're arrested and we're charging them. And we certainly believe we have enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. But until it is that they're convicted, we're saying that they are not convicted yet. I'm going to caution you. We have to prove this. So this is a charge, not a conviction. And that's basically what that's saying.
Okay.
You understand?
Right. Right. No, that absolutely makes sense. That absolutely. Because I know sometimes we see like a lot of these articles come out and we're like, oh my God, we're sharing it on social media, and social media has become such like a wide audience for us to like add our opinions onto these, things. And of course, the article or the listing will never include, personal details of the case, so we're really adding in a lot of those additional details on our own. And so I started noticing that at the end of all of those articles, that little line was included that, just to note, this is, this is just a charging document. And so this person has not been convicted of this crime.
Right, they haven't been convicted, and we would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So we do that because, that is the defendant's right when it comes to trial, that, the prosecutor, we have the responsibility of proving that beyond a reasonable doubt. But nonetheless, it does tell you that there are serious charges that we have, evidence to support it.
Okay, so that makes sense. So outside of, going straight to the police or going to a trusted one, loved one, about, a rape accusation, where else would you recommend somebody reach out to if they've been assaulted? And, I also wanted to touch on men, because there are a number of men who've been assaulted either by other men or by women. And I think culturally there's just, it's like taboo to come forward that they've been assaulted. And so, like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how can we start to kind of open the conversation for guys to feel comfortable to say, not necessarily to tell their business, right? Because, nobody ever wants to divulge all these ugly details about their experience, but to come forward and say men are being sexually assaulted as well.
Yes, and I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure they know that because it's happening. But I have to say that studies and everything have shown that the vast majority of the victims are women and children. But nevertheless, men are victims and boys. And so, but I think that is probably even the most difficult of victims, the most difficult for them to come forward because of just society has this thing of, this man up macho something machismo, that makes no real sense. But nevertheless, that's harder. And I know there are a lot of more pressures if a man comes forward and reports that, he's been raped. And especially by a woman or whatever. And so they have to face, I think, probably even more ridicule, perhaps, So I think it has to do with education. It has to do with, trying to get people to understand the victimization, to understand the seriousness, to understand how these things can occur, and why a person might have been in a certain place, and that doesn't mean that it gives the person the right to violate them and assault
Right.
them and do harm to them.
And what do you say to people who are who take some time to come out about a sexual assault, maybe years after, and everybody kind of looks at it like, well, why did you take so long? Like why would you wait 5 years? You should have called the police the following day. And I mean, of course, these are people who also don't realize the complexity of reporting, a sexual assault. But like, what is your take on that?
Well, what I would say is, first of all, let me say, and I think it's important that people know that in the Virgin Islands, the statute of limitations, that means within the time within which you can bring a charge for rape and other sexual assaults, is just, there is no statute of limitations.
Oh, that's
it
good.
can occur when you're a child and you report it as a grown adult. There is no statute of limitations.
That's good.
There's a reason for that, and that's because there can be circumstances under which, when it occurred, that you might not, maybe you couldn't report it.
Right.
If it is done, a person, you're in the home, it's a person,
Exactly.
a caretaker, or you're afraid, or you're being threatened. Once you are removed from that threat, a lot of times people might feel more comfortable to come forward. So it gives that kind of time. It takes into account that the circumstances of these types of crimes and sexual assaults requires that victims would have many, many years, a long time, to be able to report that.
That's good to know. That is very good to know, because not that I'm a TV lawyer, but sometimes I think I'm a TV lawyer. But I know from watching Law and Order SVU, their statute of limitations, I think it was like 5 or 7 years. And so that was always kind of creepy to me.
Yeah, there is no statute here.
That is,
so,
that is very
there are
good
no
to know.
limitations for rape and those types of crimes.
Yeah. Okay, so in other things that are good to know, what about resources that are available, especially for women or victims? I shouldn't just say women, but for victims that are in situations where they cannot leave, or they will need additional resources post accusation or post report.
There are certain organizations, such as the Family Resource Center, that can go to, and they can have a guide the person or find them the kind of resources to protect them, get them to safety.
Okay.
Also, like the Women's Coalition in St. Croix, and just because it's called Women's Coalition, they work evenly with male victims as well. So that
awesome.
should not that should not dissuade
Right.
male victims either. Also, you can, even if you don't want to report, and you might feel, we got to understand how devastating sexual assault affects a victim. So even if you don't want to report it, you might want to get help anyway. So let us work on you getting help and getting to safety. And that's the most important thing. And then we could deal with reporting
Everything
later.
else after, right?
And so, you could go to the victim advocates. We have a victim advocate at Department of Justice.
Okay.
We're working on getting on St. Croix as well. But still, she can be contacted. She can then assist in directing that victim. In addition to that, the Virgin Islands Police Department. They are the first responders in these cases, but even then, there's a victim advocate there. So a person can go if they want to seek help. One thing that's so important, and it's very important, that even if at the time the person doesn't know how far they want to go with it, it is so important after a sexual assault, particularly a rape, that you go to the doctor. If you go to someone you trust or something to take you, call or something, get to the emergency room, get checked. That is so important. And a lot of times the first reaction of victims is to get in the shower and bathe,
clean,
get in the bed, because they're feeling, as what I've been told, they feel dirty.
Right.
And understand that.
Of course.
But that's just one of the things.
Right.
But get to safety, get some help, get to the hospital, because you could be injured too, physically as well.
Of course, yeah. But really and truly, how do we just curb this? How do we get to a point where we bring sexual assault down to a minimum? How do we get, what do we do for that? And I don't know if any one place that we can model after has the answer, but what can we do in our community?
Yes, I don't know either about other places, but I know that it is a challenge. I think, first of all, we got to get the community to start thinking differently. And even that's from public messages and everything with respect to that, about listening to victims. Listen and not judge.
Right.
Help victims to be able to be more comfortable of coming to come forward. Have resources where that victims can feel, well, I can go here, and they know where to go. And that's also a part of public relations. Also teaching and being clear from when the kids are little in elementary school, and teach them what kind of things are wrong, bad touch, good touch, bad things, and really understand that a person cannot be violated. A person you have to have their consent for doing anything that touches or anything around their body. There are different ways of doing that, and if you can teach that from young. And then there's prosecution, there's arrest and prosecution, because it sends two messages. It sends one message that it's important that we listen, that somebody listens, and they can really bring the perpetrator or try to bring the perpetrator to justice.
Right.
So the victims can feel like, I have a voice and somebody is listening. That is so important, regardless of how it turns out, that they have a voice.
Right.
And then also it sends a message when we have these stringent penalties. We're talking about aggravated rape is 15 years to life.
Yeah.
And so when we prosecute as much as we can. Once it's prosecute, they have the arrest, we prosecute and get the convictions, and because that is a deterrent as well. That sends a message to the perpetrators, would-be perpetrators, that we're serious. So that sort of thing supports that kind of system. It's got to be a combination of things, and I think that those would be the most, I think, significant and most impactful in addressing this situation.
Awesome to hear, definitely. And so just touching on one last point before we wrap everything up.
So quickly.
I know, right? Time flies. But what resources are there for people who feel like they've been wrongfully accused? If they either have been in a situation where there was clear consent to begin with, or there was actually no sexual contact at all, and now they're being accused, and the situation looks weird. So now they're kind of just stuck in a position where they're, fighting for their innocence. But how do you go about that? So how do you really, clear that up without making yourself look?
Well, this is why every criminal case that has a defendant, that defendant has an attorney. And if the person or the accused is too indigent or too poor to afford an attorney, the courts appoint an attorney for them. So they are represented by counsel. And so that is where they're able to get their help in defending themselves. And that's part of the reason why we have that, that caveat at the end of those announcements that this is a charging document, because we want to look. The person, this has to be proven in court. And so, but that is where, if a person feels that they're, wrongfully accused, that they would go for their protection or defense or whatever, is through the system.
Okay. Makes sense. And then lastly, for the general public, what is the age of consent here in the Virgin Islands?
The age of consent generally would be 18 and older. There is also for what we call statutory rape, rape in the third degree. Let me just look at this really quickly. I think it is under 18. That would be 16. And if the person is 5 years or more older. So if you're 16, right, so I would be 16. Whereas if it's under 16 and the person is 16 years old to less than 18 years old, and that it is defendant is five or more years older, It's kind of, so
Right.
you would say around then, but then if the person is more than that, more than the 5 years, like there's a greater disparity and the person is under 16 or within that age, then there's a different penalty for that.
I see.
So it cuts it off depending on how far the disparity or the range of their age, right?
Okay.
And the reason why they do that is because, because sometimes when you have an 18-year-old or 19-year-old, which is sometimes we'll have, and they might have had sex with a 16-year-old, and they're both in high school because
Right.
there are 16-year-olds and 18-year-olds in
Right.
high school, and then you that sort of thing. It was considered, not really fair to just have a blanket
law.
law
Right.
that age, which age defines, whether or not there's consent. So that's why the law was eventually changed to look into the 5-year span and everything.
Right. Makes total sense, and also shows that our policies are shifting to really address the reality of our community and society and how people behave.
Right.
So that's good. So let me ask you: is there anything you wanted to add? Any messages you want to send out there to the community about sexual assault? Just the legal barriers of this entire thing, or
What I would like to say is that I think it is so important for us to just understand that and to stop focusing on the victim and try and understand and realize and watch, just look at that, aspect of that. The perpetrators are the perpetrators of a heinous crime. These are sexual assaults are crimes of violence. It's not crimes of sex. It's not. It's not. There's nothing amorous about it. These are violent acts against a person. And I would just say, stop trying to find and point or distract attention away from the perpetrator
Right.
to other people. And I'll just say that's something that's my pet peeve. I don't know how much time we have.
yeah,
but
we're about almost finished.
Oh, ready to close? Okay. Well, I just heard when there was an assault that occurred on a child, and I was listening to the radio stations. They talked about it the next day, and it was like a good 2/3 of the conversation was about what parents are doing and showing their children movies or something. They started talking about everything except what this person did.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We've reached our time for today's show, but I want to thank everybody who tuned in for this special episode. I'd also like to thank Ms. Attorney General here, Denise George, for joining us again. This conversation was super important and informative. If you want to keep it going, just head to our WTJX Facebook page and drop a comment under the video. And don't forget to hashtag TWM. We'll see you next time. Peace.